It's a great pleasure to be here. I find visiting Brazil always thrilling and stimulating, and I usually come out of these trips to Brazil with lots of new ideas. So I'm hoping that you will ask me some very interesting questions afterwards, and also provide me with some new ideas. The year 2013 was for me a very exciting and interesting year. For a person who's long been an observer of urban social movements and a sometimes participant in those movements, I think what happened in 2013 was significant in, I think, very important ways. You had a series of events here in Brazil, and I've heard a number of different accounts, and of course the accounts conflict as to what went on and who did what to whom. This is quite usual. But it began with a very small event, or relatively small event, which was a small protest over rising bus fares. And suddenly it not only spread to other issues, but it also spread geographically to the point where almost all the cities of Brazil became involved in a collective protest. This was paralleled by a rather similar structure of an event in Turkey. The center of the city went actually quite a very quiet protest on the first night. The second night the police overreacted, and then suddenly Istanbul is in an uproar. And it's not only Istanbul, it's also Izmir, it's also Ankara, it's all of the cities in Turkey. So both of these protests pose the question, why was the protest so contagious? Why did it run from one city to the other like wildfire? The second thing that I think was significant was that many commentators noticed that the participants in the protest were not the usual suspects. There was something different. There was an editorial in the New York Times, which is not the most reliable newspaper in the world, but occasionally has some interesting things to say. And the editorial said the interesting thing about both of these protests is first that they come in the wake of a strong period of economic growth. That Turkey had been turning in rates of growth second only to that of China. Brazil had been growing very fast. So why was it, in a period that seemed on the surface to be showing greater prosperity, why was it that this led into protest? The second thing he suggested was that the protest contained a very important element of middle-class rebellion, and that there may actually be in train a middle-class rebellion against what is going on, but there was no attempt on his part to make an analysis of what is going on and why. Certainly in the case of Turkey, and to my knowledge here also in Brazil, the movements of 2013 were not working class organized or working class based, were not trade union organized, even as elements within the trade unions and the working class obviously participated. The discontents lay elsewhere. And I think one of the immediate conclusions would be that what these rebellions suggested was a rather deep discontent emerging among many elements of the population about the qualities of urban life. That daily life in the city is becoming increasingly stressful, unbearable, increasingly inegalitarian. The answer to the question, why did these protests follow upon a period of strong economic growth, was a fairly simple and easy one, which was that there had been a revival of economic growth after 2008 to 2009 at the global level. But that revival of economic growth was not a revival of well-being for the people. In other words, the structure of what happened after 2008, 2009 was that the 1% did extremely well. The capitalist corporations did extremely well, but the people did very badly. And in fact, they were doing worse than they were before 2007, 2008. So this situation seemed to crystallize what had been happening in cities for some years beforehand. Because what happened in 2013 was not an isolated event, but it culminated a decade or more of urban protests. These urban protests included those which occurred in North Africa, which were centered on the demand for greater democracy. It included the protests against austerity, like what happened in Spain, what happened in Greece. It included the Occupy movement, which drew attention to the social inequalities and the power of the 1% over everything, and which also proliferated. So what began in Wall Street went to London and then went to many other cities of the world. And it also came on the heels of what I think was actually a very extraordinary event that we tend to forget. And that was on February the 15th, 2003. There was a mass global protest against the prospect of going to war, of the US going to war against Iraq. 2 million people were on the streets of Madrid, 2 million people in Rome, 1.5 million in Paris, 1.5 million in London, thousands in New York. Some 250 cities around the world, again simultaneously, produced a mass protest. And something interesting came out of that, as happened also as a result of the Occupy movement. That actually, the media in particular, at least certain segments of it, started to talk rather differently about the world. The New York Times, for example, had been 100% behind the idea of invading Iraq up until February the 15th. Then it read an editorial in which it said, look, this is an expression of global public opinion, and it's a massive expression of global public opinion, and global public opinion deserves to be listened to. We therefore have to take the resistance to the war against Iraq seriously. In the same way, the Occupy movement, by drawing attention to the 1% and what the 1% was about, changed the dialogue in the United States away from a situation where we could not mention social inequality as having any kind of problem attached to it, to a situation where we could start to talk about social inequality. Obama even introduced it into his re-election campaign. And there are some who argue that his introduction of social inequality into the political dialogue helped mobilize enough people to give him a second term. So that social inequality then became an issue. And there are forces now which are trying to make it a central issue. And I think the significance of this book by Piketty, which is not a very good book, and it's certainly not about capital, but it is a tremendous documentation of how capital produces greater and greater levels of inequality unless the market is regulated and unless wealth and income are redistributed. So this form of argument then suggests that social protests of this kind have been changing their quality over the last 10 or 15 years. And the quality of the argument is more and more about the qualities of urban living. And it is no accident that earlier, as we heard, many people are now finding it impossible to afford to live in the city in which they dwell. There is an exhibition opening in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York tomorrow, in which a friend of mine has actually constructed an exhibit. And the exhibit points to the fact that 50% of the population of New York City tries to live on less than $30,000 a year, which would mean that they could not reasonably afford to pay more than $1,000 a month rent for a family of 4. Nowhere in the whole New York metropolitan region can you find a place to live at that rate. Low-income populations are often spending 80% of their income on rent, and rent alone, leaving about 20% for other food necessities, let alone buying clothes or anything of that sort. This level of failure of society to meet the housing needs of the mass of the population contrasts with something else, which is the fact that in almost all of the cities of the world that I visit, there is a building boom going on. And that building boom is mainly dedicated to building accommodations for the ultra-rich. In other words, it's building high-cost condominiums for those who have fantastic incomes. And there are people around who do. I mentioned, for example, that half of the population of New York City tries to live on less than $30,000 a year. The top 1% of taxpayers in New York City in 2012 earned, each of them, $3.57 million a year. Now, what do they spend that $3.57 million on? Well, we are told by the Republican right that, well, it's good they have all that money because they invest it. And by investing it, they create jobs, and that is good for all of us. But if you look at what they actually spend it on, what do? They buy another penthouse. And then what do they do in that penthouse? They don't even bother to live in it. Because the penthouse is not a use value to them, it is a speculative exchange value. That is all they're interested in. So we have more and more condominiums in New York City for the ultra-rich in which nobody lives. There are whole streets of London where nobody lives for the very, very rich. And all the rich are doing is speculating in property values, high market property values. And one of the impacts of that is that property values in general go up and up and up. And very soon, nobody can find a place to live in the city. So this speculative activity says that actually a large segment of the capitalist class is not interested in investing in productive activity at all. It's really interested in investing in rents. And the higher the rent, the greater their return. And the more they can squeeze out of people through the rents, the better. Now, why would we be in a situation where the capitalist class, by and large, does not invest in productive activity anymore? Why would it be that the rate of return in the realm of production is so low that, in fact, they don't want to bother with such a tedious thing as investing in production, where they have to negotiate with workers and actually make something, when you can just sit there in the Bahamas on your yacht and wait for the price of your condominium to rise. And then maybe you'll sell it, take the capital gain, and then you'll do it all over again. This is going on not only in a place like New York City. Every city I've been to, you find the same story. I was in Istanbul just 3 weeks ago. And in Istanbul, property prices are even worse than they are in London. And they're worse than they are in New York City and Manhattan. It's impossible for ordinary people to find a place to live. And at the same time as it's impossible to find a place to live, the state is very busy trying to create space so that capital can build even more condominiums. And how does it do that? It goes into an area, declares it is a slum, says it needs to be cleared, sends the people 30 kilometers out onto the periphery. Well, I tell you the story, and you've heard it, you know it, you know. And if I tell you this hard tale about Istanbul, you'll tell me, aren't you talking about Sao Paulo? Aren't you talking, you know, about Rio? Aren't you, why are you telling us this about Istanbul? We have that at home. But I think there's something very important here, that this phenomena is global. That is, it's not local, it's global. It's going on everywhere. And there's a big question as to why it's going on everywhere and what one should be doing about it. Now here's where my good old friend Karl Marx comes in and helps. And Karl whispers to me in the night, he says, have you checked out the theory of rent recently? I say, okay, all right, I'll go do that tomorrow when I wake up. And I do. And then I start to look at the whole dynamic of capital accumulation and what it's about, and why it is doing these things, and why it is so concentrated these days on city building and city making of a certain sort, in which capital exercises its right to the city with the right of an affluent bourgeoisie, and usually the right of a complicitous city and state administration, in which they're engaging in certain practices of city building, which have a certain character to them. And I think it's important to have an understanding of the nature of the beast that we're facing. Urbanization has always been an important part of what capital accumulation has been about. There have always been people who have accumulated fortunes as developers, as rentiers. There's always been a concentration of economic power on city building. But that concentration has usually been local. But what I've suggested right now would say it's no longer local, it's global. How did it go global? And why did it go global? Why is it that we can now meaningfully talk about a concept that Henri Lefebvre developed more than 40 years ago now, which is the idea of planetary urbanization? And I want you to think about that, planetary urbanization. We're urbanizing planet Earth at an incredibly rapid rate. And within that urbanization of planet Earth, there exists certain economic imperatives which right now make it extremely difficult for capital to do anything else. In other words, for you to imagine that capital can continue to exist without doing all these things that I've mentioned and which you've experienced, that is an impossibility. In fact, we are really at a situation where urbanization is vital to the reproduction of capital accumulation and the reproduction of the power of the capitalist class. Let me give you a few examples of the dynamic of how urbanization and capital accumulation have come together historically. There's a saying recently come out in the United States, which I like a lot, which says that capital gets out of its crises by building houses and filling them with things. Now, that's a crude sort of way of looking at it. I want to argue that capital actually gets into crises by building too many houses and filling them with too many ridiculous things, at the same time as it gets out of crises by building houses and filling them with ridiculous things. And it is that dialectic which I think is significant. The first example I found of this, which was terribly important in terms of my own learning process, was when I did a lot of research on what happened in Second Empire Paris from the period between 1848 and 1871. 1847-48 was a period of crisis of capital accumulation. Now, Marx defines a crisis as a situation in which capital and labor exist side by side with no way to put them back into productive uses, even in the face of crying social needs. So in 1848, there was mass unemployment of the working classes in Paris and elsewhere, and there was mass unemployment of surplus capital. It was there, but nobody knew how to use it. And as a result of that, there was a revolution, the 1848 Workers' Revolution, which was then crushed by the bourgeoisie with military force. But then they turned around and they needed to find an answer to the crisis. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't find a way. Which meant, in a way, they were doomed unless something changed. Well, what changed was the nephew of the famous Napoleon Bonaparte came to political power and then said, well, you proclaim me emperor, you give me dictatorial powers and I'll solve the crisis for you. So that's what happened. He became a dictator. And he then said, all right, we're going to solve it by a number of ways. And one of the primary ways we solve it is by rebuilding Paris. And he brought Haussmann to Paris and said, rebuild the whole city. And within a little while, everybody was back to full employment. Not only did he say rebuild the city, but he said to everybody else, change social life in the city. So he instructed the court to change all their uniforms. So there's full employment in the needle trades. All the women went back to work making new uniforms. Then they were building these new department stores, and there was fashion on the streets. They were mobilizing fashion. Paris became the city of light, the center of fashion and cultural activity. And, you know, and of course, there were the Impressionists and all the others around, and, you know. So, life changed dramatically into the Second Empire. Urban life changed. Gas lamps came, sewers came, water came. The modernization of the city and the building of the new city. But, of course, this meant a great deal of displacement. A lot of the working people who lived in the city were displaced. They were thrown out and sent to the periphery. Heard that before? Yeah, happened in Second Empire, Paris. And the people who were building the city were actually denied the possibility of living in the city because property prices went up, rents went up. They had to live way out on the periphery. But the building of the city actually generated strong economic growth. But the building of the city also required reform of financial institutions and reform of financial structures. So you get this innovation in Second Empire Paris, which is doing all of these things. And it actually results in a boom. But as often happens with a boom, there is an overbuilding. You build too many houses. The municipality undertook too many new boulevards to build. Too many things. And in 1867, everybody suddenly said, is this for real? Are these prices for real? And suddenly there's a crash in 1867. Haussmann falls from power, everything goes bad, working class start to come back from the outside of the city and say, we are going to take back the city. That's what they threatened to do in 1868 and 1869. What Napoleon did was to try to divert them by going to war with Germany. Unfortunately, he lost the war. And Paris was besieged by the Germans, and then we have the Paris Commune, which is the people taking back the city they had built for themselves, back from the bourgeoisie. This was, if you like, one of the first lessons I learned historically. But then I see it repeated again and again. For example, after World War II, the United States actually solved its Great Depression problems of the 1930s by doing what? Building the suburbs, building the new highway systems, building houses and filling them with stupid things. And then, it wasn't only just doing that in certain parts of the country, it was about a regional development. The American South and West were underdeveloped in 1945. Los Angeles was a small town. But by the time you get to 1960, Los Angeles is beginning to look like the Los Angeles we know. So the United States got out of its Great Depression by this huge urbanization project, building the interstate highway system, building the park system, building new suburbs. This was an urban solution to the economic dilemmas that were plaguing the United States at the time. But, as always happened, it went too far and too fast. And there were two things that then was an impediment to it. First, on the one hand, that developmentalism concentrated on the well-being of only certain segments of the population, mainly white working class. And it left behind African American populations and other marginalized groups who were left with no services in the city. So we have a series of urban uprisings in the 1960s. And in 1968, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, about 120 cities in the United States saw major protests. The city I was about to live in Baltimore, a large segment of the central city was burned down. Washington was burned, a lot of central Washington was burned down. Los Angeles, everywhere. It was, if you like, again, a crisis that went throughout the whole urban system. And here you see again something. I've mentioned the contagion effect through the urban system. 1848 was contagious throughout Europe. There was a Paris Revolution, then there was one in Vienna, then there's one in Berlin, then there's one in Milan, then there's one, it flowed across the European space. In 1968, assassination of Martin Luther King, it flowed across all urban areas of the United States. It became contagious. So there was a crisis. Now that crisis came about for, I think, a very simple reason. The capital, faced with the dilemma of accumulation, had chosen a certain path which was going to be led by demand. So the expansion of the 1950s and 1960s was a demand-led expansion. The state created the demand by building the highways. It created the demand by providing the credit to buy the houses that were being built in the suburbs. It created the demand by actually favoring working class institutions so that they had good bargaining position over wages and things of that kind, cost of living adjustments. So the state was working on making sure the demand was there. And when you make sure the demand is there, then you get a certain kind of economic world constructed. And what is so intriguing about Volume 2 of Capital is that actually Marx describes this world in Volume 2 of what a demand-led economy would look like. And the demand-led economy is such as that it has to overcome to some degree the levels of social inequality. It has to overcome the powerlessness of the working classes. It has to use the state to create debt finance for expansion. And it actually has to use state power to curb the aspirations of the capitalist class. The top tax rate in the United States, up until 1982, from 1945 to 1982, the top tax rate never became less than 81%. And for a period in the 1940s, it was 92%. In other words, the very rich were being taxed at the rate of 92% when they got above a certain income level. Now, we are told that high taxation on the rich inhibits growth. Actually, this period was the period of the highest growth that there's ever been in the United States. But that high growth was going to building, building, building. And overbuilding occurred in the suburbs, whereas under-attention to the needs of marginalized populations and actually dislocated populations in inner cities led to riots and revolution in the inner cities. That led to the crisis of the 1970s. And the crisis of the 1970s was also a crisis of urbanization. The property market collapsed in 1973, not only in the United States, but in Europe, Australia, various other places. How then were we going to solve the problem of this demand-led expansion? Well, the answer was, why don't you go read Volume 1 of Capital? And if you read Volume 1 of Capital, you'll find that Marx is not interested in demand at all. He's interested in the production of surplus value. And he says, what are the optimal conditions for the production of surplus value? The optimal conditions are those in which the working class is totally disempowered, the level of wages is low, you have high levels of unemployment, which disciplines the labor force, and the capitalists can do what they want with workers in the labor process because it's got total power over labor. So in the 1970s, economies like that of the United States switched from a demand-side expansion to a supply-side expansion. And the supply side said, destroy the power of labor. And you look at all of the data and look, see, what's the share of labor, of wages in national income since the 1970s? And all the graphs of the OECD countries go like this. Labor is going to get less and less. There's a systematic attack upon the power of labor. It's a political attack. It's a social attack. But the most sophisticated form of the attack was to create a situation in which capital could be highly mobile and could move around the world. Now, the form of capital that is most easily moved is money capital. Money capital is what I call the butterfly form of capital. It flits around the world and lands where it likes. The butterfly form of capital had to be liberated. So you get tremendous reform of financial institutions and deregulation of finance. The result was that finance capital deindustrialized much of the United States, deindustrialized much of Europe, deindustrialized almost any place where there was strong working class power. Even in Mumbai, the textile industry in Mumbai had a very strong union movement. Deindustrialize it via finance capital. So the financialization that came in after 1975 or so was not an accident. It was part of a strategy to disempower labor. Because the most mobile form of capital could move, whereas labor was harder for it to move around. And as a result, together with all of the political repressions, and a coup d'etat here, and military apparatus is there, and, you know, Pinochet and all of that, labor was disciplined. But that then led to the problem, well, you're getting now high rates of return for the capitalist class. Very high rates of return. They're doing extremely well. But they've got a problem. Who are they going to sell their product to when the workers are getting less and less well off? Answer, give the workers credit. So the workers become increasingly indebted, which means debt-encumbered workers are even less likely to go on strike and be militant, because they've got to pay their debts. And this is particularly true, of course, of housing debt. So you actually get the workers to become involved in capitalism by being debt-encumbered homeowners who are going to be politically passive. Genius solution. But then you find, actually, you haven't got enough debt-encumbered workers out there, so you start offering debt instruments to people who don't have any income, which is where you get the subprime mortgage thing coming from. You're jacking up demand because you're not creating the demand by expanding employment and expanding wages. So what you see here is a crash which has major influences. But here I would like you to notice something. There seems to be, particularly over the last 2 or 3 decades, a new law of capital accumulation emerging. And that law is the perpetual reproduction of speculative booms in housing, property, land, and urban development. Because the crash of 2007-2008 was based in the housing market, then went to financial institutions. But it also affected consumption within the United States. People were using housing to bolster their consumption. And they would do it in the following way. You'd buy a house for $200,000 on a mortgage. 5 years later, you would remortgage the house for $3,000. You'd take the extra $100,000 and then just spend it. So consumption in the United States was largely supported by people refinancing their mortgages in a rising housing market. When that all broke down, they couldn't consume anymore. So consumerism in the United States is dead in the water in 2009. Who is providing all the consumer goods to the United States? China. What happens to China's export industries? Within 3 months, China had lost about 30 million jobs in the export industries. 30 million jobs was the estimate that we were getting. The export industries crash in China. China is terrified of mass unemployment. What was it going to do? And what did it do? By the end of 2009, there was a report from the International Labour Organization and the IMF on net job losses because of the crisis. And China, they estimated, had lost 3 million jobs. Now, if the data's right, this means that somehow or other China created 27 million jobs in 2009 alone. How the hell did it do it? It was quite simple, actually. The Central Committee turned to everybody and said, build. It turned to the bankers and it said, lend. And of course, if the US president told the bankers to lend, they'd tell them to go screw off. But you don't do that to the Chinese. If you're a banker in China and the Central Committee says lend, you lend. And you lend big. And you tend, and every municipal government was told, build, build, build. So you suddenly get this huge, huge urbanization program inside of inside of China. A huge program. They've built dozens of cities from ground up, from almost nothing, into huge cities. And at least 3 of them which have no people living in them yet. The property market in Shanghai goes crazy because not only were the banks lending to the developers, they were also lending to the buyers. This is a neat way in which you get an asset bubble, because if the financial institution lends to the developer, and the developer then lends to, sells it to somebody who's financed by the financier, you see this as kind of circle of demand and supply like this. So the Chinese were doing this. The result is that since 2009, China has consumed half of the world's cement supplies. It's consumed half of the world's steel supplies, a large segment of the world's copper. Anybody who's producing raw materials has been selling to the China trade, didn't get affected deeply by the crisis. Latin America was turned into a vast soybean plantation for the China trade. You don't like to hear that, but that's true. And you become highly dependent upon this urbanization process in China. In other words, it's Chinese urbanization which actually saved the global economy from a huge, huge recession. Because China recovered from a deep sort of crash in 2009 when it fell off to, I don't know, a growth rate of around 6%, then recovered to 10%. But now the Chinese growth rate is coming down. Because, like all those other things I've mentioned about what happened in Second Empire Paris or what happened in the United States towards the end of the 1960s, There's clearly an overproduction of the built environment going on. There's clearly an overcreation of urbanization. And like the United States, of course, you're rebalancing the whole economy by building in cities in the interior to balance with those on the coast. So what you find then is that this urbanization process is absolutely essential to the survival of capital. Had there not been an urbanization process in China after 2008, 2009, the world would have experienced one of the worst depressions ever, because this was the only thing that actually kept the global economy alive. And now that seems to be in some trouble. Now we're faced with an interesting situation. Europe is dead in the water as far as growth is concerned. Japan is dead in the water as far as growth is concerned. There's zero growth there. China's growth is coming down. All of the countries that are associated with the China trade, look just what's happening in Latin America, are suffering a fall-off in growth. In other words, growth is coming down. And the question is, where will growth pick up? Well, what can grow inside of currently existing capitalism? One of the answers is, of course, all that we've been talking about, the building of condominiums for the ultra-rich. In other words, and capital loves to do that. Furthermore, capital loves mega projects, new stadiums and all that sort of thing that you were complaining about last year. It loves to build things which are about spectacles, because spectacles are instantaneously consumed. They have no turnover time, they have no lifetime, they're done, they're gone. You know, you have your World Cup and it's gone. You're going to have your Olympics and it's gone. And the spectacles become more and more elaborate. I suggest to people you go look at the opening ceremonies of Olympic Games to just see how spectacular the spectacle has become over time, and more spectacular. And it's very interesting that almost every city that's hosted an Olympic Games goes bankrupt afterwards. And of course Greece went bankrupt entirely. So Brazil, watch out. Because this is a great way in which the developers make money, and the construction interests make money. They make up money like bandits, and then they go, and then you're left, you know, holding the debt. And you get paid, you have to pay off the costs. This is the game that is played. So capital loves that kind of urbanization. It enjoys it immensely. Capital cannot actually address the question of affordable housing. It cannot address the question of qualities of daily life in ordinary neighborhoods. It cannot address the small-scale institutional structures that need to be created to make solidarities work at the neighborhood level. It cannot address those things that are actually meaningful in terms of a decent life and a decent living environment for the mass of the population. And I think what we're seeing through these urban protests, which have been going on over the last decade or more, a recognition that that is what capital is doing. And that capital is unsatisfactory. And that capital is not able to meet the needs of the mass of the population. And I'm sorry to say that the idea that you can actually reform capital on this is pie in the sky. It won't happen. You can modify what capital does. You can keep it quieter than it is. But right now that's very difficult because they control all the money power. We live in a world where there's an oligarchy essentially in control. The top 2,000 families in the world control, I don't know, 50% of the world's wealth. How do you deal with that situation when that wealth is used to control the media, to control politics, to control even university education. How do you deal with it? They are not interested in changing anything. In fact, I think the capitalist class right now is very, very interested in having completely dysfunctional government. Because completely dysfunctional government means nothing can happen, and if nothing can happen, they can continue to make money as well as they want to. So since 2007, 2008, the one group that has recovered its wealth and assets perfectly well, and in fact increased by some 20 or 30% its wealth, is the top 1%. Capitalist corporations in the United States are operating on the highest rate of profit than ever recorded. So capital is doing very well. And the top 1% is doing very well. It's just the people are doing very badly. And the people are beginning to speak up, which is what sort is happening in these urban disruptions and urban eruptions that we see. But then there's an interesting kind of question. Why is it that capital is in this messy situation of having to dictate the qualities of urban life in the way it is doing? It has everything to do with something which is deeply structural. And I want to end with this. Capital has to grow. It has to grow at a compound rate. That is, capital starts very slowly to grow, but then it compounds and it starts to go up, and then it becomes suddenly very rapid. There's a great series of stories about how to understand compound growth. Compounding growth at 3% means that you double every 25, 30 years. Now, if you double the economy every 25, 30 years, it's analogous to the story of what happened to the guy who invented the game of chess. Offered a reward, he said, okay, put 1 grain of rice on the first square, 2 on the second, and then double it on every square after. Sounded okay, and the king who was offering the reward said, fine, no problem. The trouble is, by the time you get to the 32nd square, there's no rice left in the world. Which leaves you with the problem of how do you get from the 32nd square to the 64th square where there's no rice left in the world. The only way you can do that is to promise on future rice output. That is, all right, we promise you 2 years supply next year, 4 years supply after that, and pretty soon you're talking about an infinite supply of rice into the future. That is a fiction. So you move from a real economy to a fictitious economy. Now capital's like that. When capital was beginning in the beginning of the 19th century, it was made up of what was going on in Manchester, Birmingham, and a few other industrial cities, parts of what was going on in North America. Perpetual expansion at a compound rate to create the world market. That is, it's got to expand and become global. Because this 2 or 3% compound rate of growth means that at some point you've got to envelop the whole world. Now, I think there was a problem around 1970. But the problem in 1970 was solved by the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, so all of Eastern Europe and Russia are then integrated into the capitalist system. China joins the capitalist system. So that saved capital because that was the expansion. But there's no China left to expand into. There's no Russia left to expand into. Yeah, there's Africa. Yeah, there's some places to go. But actually the big, big expansion of the system is over geographically. And we're now talking about 3% compound rate of growth on everything that's already going on in China, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Europe, you know. I mean, this is a huge, huge problem. And my sense is that
this compound growth has reached an inflection point where it's actually extremely difficult for capital to find new profitable investment opportunities, which is why it's turning to urbanization to attempt to solve its problem. Think of what Curitiba looked like in 1970. Think of what's happened since 1970. Then imagine that pace of development quadrupled over the next 25 years. What kind of city would you be living in? What would it look like? And where would there be room for people to live if, in fact, you've built more and more condominiums for the ultra-rich who just simply treat them as speculations? In other words, it seems to me that there's a compelling argument that says we should fight against the way capital is building cities in every way we can. But we've also got to recognize that that's probably the only way capital can survive. And if that is the only way that capital can survive, then if we stopped capital doing what it's doing to contemporary cities, then capital is over. That is, we really have to start to think about what kind of world could we construct that would be anti-capitalist, non-capitalist. Now, my own conclusion about this, and you can dissent, probably will, is that we have no option except right now, from the standpoint of the social movements, to commit ourselves to the idea of an anti-capitalist struggle. An anti-capitalist struggle that's across the board. That is, it's got to deal with capitalist institutions, with capitalist power structures, with the capitalist corruption. And everybody likes to talk about the corruption of individuals, but think about the corruption of capital over the political process, over the media, over knowledge production, and the like. This is why I'm an anti-capitalist. And I'm not an anti-capitalist because I think capitalists are evil and leftists are good. In fact, some leftists are pretty horrible. And some capitalists are quite nice. I'm not anti-capitalist because of some defect in my DNA. I'm not anti-capitalist because I was raised to be so. I actually didn't start reading Marx till I was 35 years old. So if you're young, you know, you've got plenty of time. But the critique we can find of capital accumulation. For instance, I've mentioned the Volume 1 and the Volume 2 analysis. Marx talks about the contradictory unity between production and realization, and how powerful this contradiction is over social life. If we do well on the Volume 1 analysis, and we really push labor into the mire and exploit labor to the hilt, we gain immense profits, but we find no market. So we lose. If we do the same over there, then we actually empower workers, and workers start to become much too powerful, as was the case at the end of the 1960s, and they have. So there's this contradiction between production and realization. We had an economic theory called Keynesianism, which dominated the period 1945 to 1975. It was then said Keynesianism is dead, demand analysis is dead. We went to supply side. We went to monetarism, a theory of monetarism, neoclassical monetarism. So we actually went for another theory. The interesting thing about this crisis is that there's been no new economic theory generated, as happened in the 1930s and happened in the 1970s, to help us understand, first, how we got into the crisis, and second, how we might get out of it. And the reason there is no economic theory is because there can be no economic theory, because we are locked into the contradictory unity of production and realization. There is no way out within the rules of the capitalist game. That is so theoretically, and it seems to be the case practically. Because if you look at the global economy right now, everybody looks at capital and the stock markets and says, people are doing well. But actually, that's all fiction. People are not doing well. Capital is doing well. The people are doing badly. And if you were living in a system which serves you so badly that you are doing badly all the time, then you should take Marx's advice, who said, you know, there is a moment where we have to say to capital, for all of the good things it's done, healthcare is a right, education is a right, they should be free goods. They should be open to all. But capital insists on commodifying everything. It'll soon commodify our genetic makeup. We may soon have to have a license to have a kid because somebody's patented life. So here we go. This is the moment we are in, and we've got to decommodify things, prevent the future commodification of knowledge, biological DNA and all the rest of it, and find a way to actually say, ciao, to capital. You've had a good run. You've done some fantastic things. Thank you very much. Let's now get on with making a decent life and a decent living environment for the mass of the people. Thanks very much.
Meu nome é Yuri, eu ajudo a organizar junto com o pessoal aí um grupo de estudos de leitura do Capital, Círculo Marx o nome, então nada mais apropriado que ter um professor que, sem mesmo saber, ajuda muito a gente com o livro para entender o Capital, então já agradeço desde já. Minha pergunta é que dois fatos interessantes, é que Curitiba tem 90 mil imóveis vazios, cerca de 90 mil imóveis vazios dentro desse dado parecido com o que o professor falou. E também nós vemos que das grandes empresas que financiam campanhas políticas no Brasil, as principais são construtoras, são multinacionais da área de construção civil. Isso, inclusive, ajuda a tornar tão interessante o conceito do professor do accumulation by dispossession, né? Acumulação por espoliação, que é um conceito que ilumina muito bem essa realidade toda que o professor trouxe. No entanto, o marxismo tem como polêmico, como um debate a ser feito sobre esse conceito. A gente tem autores como Robert Renner, que criticam em alguns aspectos do conceito do professor, no sentido de que teria sido levado longe demais para explicar algumas realidades. Nós temos professores, por exemplo, aqui no Brasil, como a Virginia Fontes, que acreditam que não seria necessária a criação de um conceito novo, que o próprio conceito de expropriação do Marx daria conta, enfim. Queria saber a posição do professor sobre essas críticas e sobre esse conceito em específico. Obrigado.
Hi, Professor Harvey. I'd like to do my question in English. So, my name is Antonio. I'm doing my PhD in economics here at Federal University of Paraná. And I've heard your argument before, this argument. Summarizing it, capital never finds a solution to crisis. He deceives the other problem on the current crisis and generates another one that ends with another crisis. But I think you know that there is a reason to that. There is something in capitalism mode of production that makes capitalists and the movement of capital generate the next crisis with the solution of the current crisis. And I would like to ask you to elaborate on that. I mean, I'd like to, if you think there is a reason, what is this reason? Thank you.
Boa noite, meu nome é Gabriel. Boa noite, meu nome é Gabriel, eu participo do Círculo Marx, também com o pessoal aqui de Curitiba. E a gente estava debatendo há um mês atrás um apontamento que você faz no seu livro Para Entender o Capital, livro 1. No capítulo sobre o dinheiro, você afirma que o Marx não se estendeu muito na defesa da teoria do valor do trabalho e afirma que inúmeros marxistas acabaram abandonando essa teoria do valor do trabalho. Então eu queria que você falasse um pouco mais sobre isso, sobre quem são os marxistas que acabaram renegando a teoria do valor do trabalho, por que eles fizeram isso e quais são as possíveis saídas. É isso, obrigado.
Vamos fazer bloco de 5, fica mais fácil.
Olá, gostaria de agradecer primeiramente a vida do senhor na nossa cidade, assim, é uma honra tê-lo presente aqui. Uma questão interessante, assim, são alguns movimentos que estão surgindo, que já surgem, já faz um certo tempo no mundo, que se apresenta como uma via, tá, justamente para esse processo de construção de uma nova sociedade. Certo? A gente tem um processo muito interessante ocorrendo na Índia, com os naxalitas, e ocorrendo nas Filipinas, onde eles já controlam mais de 1/3 do país, em ambos os países. Então, eu gostaria de saber qual é a visão do senhor com relação à via que eles propõem como uma alternativa, assim, como uma forma de subverter as coisas como são e realmente conseguir construir uma nova sociedade.
Boa noite a todo mundo, boa noite professor, me chamo Luiz Alberto, sou do Movimento Estudantil Popular Revolucionário, MEPR. Só um parênteses, quero dar o parabéns ao camarada tradutor, obrigado pelo esforço, parabéns mesmo, muito obrigado. Professor, pergunta simples, desculpa fugir, temática se for fugir, queria muito a sua opinião. Existe uma contradição, uma discussão muito grande entre vários teóricos marxistas, entre eles o Che, o Mao Tse-tung, a respeito da nova política econômica, a NEP, da União Soviética da época de Lenin. Queria muito ouvir a sua opinião sobre isso, um estudioso do marxismo atual, internacional, grande pesquisador, seria de muito enriquecimento e orientação para o meu estudo como militante revolucionário. Obrigado.
Professor, então agora a gente passa as suas respostas para depois mais 5 perguntas.
I can see that people have been studying their theory. Accumulation by dispossession, I prefer this for one very simple reason. That if I'm talking to a farmer who's lost his land and I tell him this is an example of primitive accumulation, he'll stare at me as if to say, what the fuck are you talking about? If I say this is accumulation by dispossession, he'll say, yeah, I understand what you mean. Why is it that Marxists want to hang on to a language which nobody necessarily understands apart from themselves? Why not use another word which everybody understands? And in particular, I think accumulation by dispossession takes up a whole set of things that are not mentioned in Marx's discussion of primitive accumulation, including things like the appropriation of genetic, of biotechnology and patents and all kinds of things of that sort. The way in which rent is being extracted from knowledge and information. I think that we need a word that actually resonates both with the contemporary situation
and with which in a wide range of circumstances in which there's some level of stealing, robbery, thievery going on. So I just, people will go on and on about, it doesn't quite fit with Marx's chapter whatever in volume 1 of Capital, and fair enough, it doesn't. But why, we've got to keep this language alive, and it's got to have some way of meaning something. For example, to people who are dispossessed of their housing. I don't know, do you, when you're talking to dispossessed people of their housing, talk about primitive accumulation? Or would you rather talk about accumulation by dispossession? I think, I'd rather talk in that sort of simple language. The second question about the reason. I don't think, my understanding of Marx, and I'm kind of pretty different, I suppose, on this, is that Marx has a very interesting way of looking at crises. And if you start to look at what he says, you'll find he's got all kinds of different mechanisms going on. Marxists have canonized something called the falling rate of profit theory, which in my view is a fairly marginal theory in general. And I think that the evidence would suggest that capital never solves its crisis tendencies, it simply moves them around. Just look recently at what happened in 2007, 2008. A crisis in the housing market becomes a financial crisis, becomes a sovereign debt crisis, which then becomes an underconsumption crisis. In other words, the crisis moves around. And its particular manifestation in a particular place and time becomes significant. It also moves around geographically. It started mainly in the housing markets of Southern California, Arizona, Nevada, Florida, and Georgia. I mean, it had a very specific locus, and it then was contagious. And it infected, as it were, the housing markets of Spain, Ireland, and the like, and then it went, sort of viral through the financial system to anybody who'd been silly enough to invest in secondary mortgage instruments, and that was all over the place. So you find a municipality in Norway that had put all of its money into these collateralized debt obligations suddenly found itself bankrupt. On the other hand, the Chinese banking system didn't touch these things, and so it wasn't affected by it. So who gets affected by it, how it moves, is something which becomes terribly important. So I don't think there is a way of saying there is the reason. There's only one reason. And I think the tendency to look for one single bullet reason, that this is the reason, and if you only put your finger on this, it's all gone. Capital is extremely flexible, it moves it around, and so you put your finger on it and it's gone somewhere else. And I think that this is very important to do. And when you look at how Marx actually looked at some of the crises, particularly those of 1847, 48, and 1857, you see a different story. I didn't quite understand the question about the value of work. If this is about the labor theory of value, I think then obviously there are several people who've abandoned the labor theory of value among Marxists. There's lots of reinterpretation of the labor theory of value going on, and there are some challenges. I think the time is ripe for a general debate on the role of the labor theory of value in the contemporary situation. I think there has to be a discussion of what its meaning is and how its meaning can be understood under contemporary circumstances. There are various people who, for example, now wish to talk about cognitive capitalism and the value of cognitive labor. There are various other people who want to expand the notion of value so that it looks at sort of technological innovation and questions of that sort, and cultural production as being value producing. And I think it's a very significant discussion and debate. I am on record as saying that I think the production of value has everything to do with the production and reproduction of urban life. And that if you say that is productive of value, you end up with a class configuration that's very different from the traditional proletariat. But that's another debate, and it's an interesting debate, and one that I think has to be worked at. The movements, look, there are tremendous numbers of alternative ways of trying to deal with the capitalist dilemma these days. There are solidarity economies, there are cooperative movements, there are the recuperated factories, there are worker control movements, there are peasant movements, the Indian peasant movement was mentioned, there are various other forms of activity such as those laid out in Via Campesina. There's a tremendous ferment of discussion of alternatives. And I think this is therefore very exciting, and all of them need to be sort of understood and thought about, and we should be asking the question, what can they contribute to the construction of an anti-capitalist alternative? I don't think what the anti-capitalist alternative will look like is self-evident. I think that there is room for a great deal of discussion and debate. And again, I find it very interesting to work with people who are working in these alternative communities and alternative structures to see what can be said and what can be done. The question about new economic policy and Mao, Che, and the like. Personally, I'm a little resistant to going back into a detailed debate about all of that. It's not that I feel that there's nothing to be learned from it, because I think there is something great to be learned from it. But I think the circumstances we're in right now are such as to say, well, I can't find an answer to this by going back to Lenin, or I can't find an answer to this by going back to Mao, or I cannot find an answer to this by reading Che or looking at new economic policy. I would study all of that to the degree I have as historical, that is the best thing that people could come up with at the time at which they were writing and the circumstances in which they find themselves. But the circumstances we have today are special. And I think what I get from Marx is not a set of prescriptions as to how to proceed, but a way of thinking, a method of inquiry, a method of critique. Because what Marx did argue, and I think this is something I do take from him, is that if we're going to talk about alternatives, many of those alternatives must already exist around us in some form or other. And so what we have to find are those things which are already with us, which can actually provide the basis for alternative ways of being. And for example, take the realm of the labor theory of value and the relation and what I would call the question of social labor. If we take the view that one of the most important things in society is the social labor that we do for others. Now, the labor theory of value talks about the social labor we do for others as mediated through the market system and as conducted under capitalist relations of production. So that's the labor theory of value specific to capitalism. Is there an alternative value theory, which would be about the social labor we might do for each other on the basis of mutual support, mutual aid, and voluntary and unremunerated? How much does society depend upon unremunerated labor? And there are some very interesting areas now about labor processes where unremunerated labor becomes very significant. For instance, the whole field of software production, peer-to-peer computing and all the rest of it involves a lot of social labor that people do for each other without compensation. And if you belong to one of those circles that deals with sort of software development in that kind of mutual support way, you'll see a completely different set of social relations. These are the kinds of social relations which suggest that there's an alternative value theory which exists in our society. Some of it exists within households, some of it exists within kinship structures. So that, again, we can talk about alternative ways of social labor is mobilized and how it is mobilized. We know at the neighborhood level that neighborhood solidarities actually become very, very important in terms of the construction of a decent life and a decent living environment in urban settings. And that mutual aid and mutual structures of this kind therefore need to be encouraged and therefore need to be developed. So there is, to me, an alternative labor theory of value, which is one which is not mediated through the market and one which is not constructed under the capitalist social relations of production. And it is that value theory that you want to see expanded in society. And it's an expansion of value which also rests on use value, not an exchange value, which eradicates the exchange value side of things and concentrates entirely on use value. The big problem in housing right now is that we're supposed to get decent housing for decent living environment through an exchange value system that cannot do it. And we're told again and again and again, you've got to mobilize the exchange value system. Well, you'll find organizations around that are mobilizing voluntary labor and building housing, provided they can get free land. Now, this is the thing. When land costs a hell of a lot, it's very difficult. So you've got to actually liberate land, and I think the question you're raising, one of the things that's very, very important, is to actually somehow or other end the dynamics of land speculation. Now, how you do that is an interesting kind of problem. I would actually like to see a land tax. And I would like to see everybody declaring the value of their own land, which would then, of course, set their own rate of taxation. But whatever they declare would then be the price that we would pay if we wish to acquire their property for better development. Get the trick? If they declare the value too low, then actually I can start land banking by buying up their property at their declared value. In other words, you can buy up their property at their declared value. So you start to reduce the possibility of speculation. You can amass land resources, and then if people had free land, they could build their own housing through voluntary structures of labor and materials and all the rest of it in a much more effective way. The big barrier to decent housing, for decent living environment, is land cost. And if you could somehow or other stop the speculation in land values, then you've gone a long, long way. So these are the sorts of things that need to be done in the here and now. And I don't see that necessarily, going back and studying, what happened in the new economic policy and so on. I mean, it's interesting to do. I did it, years ago. I don't go back to it now, but it's valuable to do in its own right. But I think if we look there for answers, as opposed to saying, in those historical circumstances, this is what these people did, and this is how they understood the problem, and what the problems were with how they'd understood it. So yes, that's a good idea to recuperate that history and recognize some of what went on there. But I don't think that gives us the solutions. The solutions have to lie around us in the here and now, and we have to find ways to expand upon it, both in terms of the theory we construct and the way we might modify Marx's theory to deal with the contemporary circumstance, and the way in which we might actually start to implement expansions of these spheres of alternative value structures and alternative value systems.
Boa noite. Bom, vou fazer a pergunta mesmo com... meu nome é José Ricardo, sou professor do mestrado de Políticas Públicas e do Departamento de Transportes aqui da Universidade Federal, pesquisador do grupo de pesquisa em economia política do poder. Tenho duas questões. Você, Harvey, abordou nos seus vários trabalhos, na verdade, a questão da expansão geográfica do capitalismo e também da importância do lugar e do investimento de capital localizado, né? Especialmente em infraestrutura, nos processos de produção e circulação do capital.
No livro Cidades Rebeldes também discutiu o monopólio da renda e as determinações desse monopólio da renda na valorização da terra urbana, o conceito de terra como forma fictícia do capital que deriva das expectativas de aluguéis futuros, e também, em outro capítulo, a importância do crédito e da securitização nas determinações do valor da terra urbana. A pergunta, né? Os juros, a renda e os aluguéis, no entanto, parecem ter dinâmicas próprias, baseadas em fatores distintos, né? Então, no entanto, apesar da correlação que é possível estabelecer entre eles, e apesar também normalmente se estabelecer uma causalidade entre o valor do crédito, ou o valor do juro, e o valor da terra, eu gostaria de saber se não é possível estabelecer também um nexo causal, uma causalidade entre o processo de especulação, o processo de circulação do crédito e o valor da terra, ou seja, o valor da terra pode ser consequência do processo especulativo no mercado financeiro, especialmente nos fundos imobiliários. E a segunda pergunta, se for o caso, se você tiver informação sobre isso, né? Há uma polêmica sobre a possibilidade ou não de existir uma bolha imobiliária no Brasil. Especialmente, apesar de a gente ter tido nos últimos 7 anos valorizações da ordem de 30% a 40% no valor da terra por ano, que parou no último ano, 2014, essa valorização, tem informação sobre isso, né? Há uma polêmica sobre a possibilidade ou não de existir uma bolha imobiliária no Brasil. Especialmente, apesar de a gente ter tido nos últimos 7 anos valorizações da ordem de 30% a 40% no valor da terra por ano, que parou no último ano, 2014, essa valorização se encerrou, há um baixo nível de securitização do crédito imobiliário. Em função disso, é possível realmente não haver uma bolha imobiliária no Brasil? Obrigado.
Próximo.
Boa noite, meu nome é Felipe, sou estudante de mestrado do Programa de Pós-graduação em Políticas Públicas aqui da Federal. Como o senhor colocou no início da sua fala, relativo às manifestações do ano passado aqui no Brasil, o Brasil ele entrou nessa rota das grandes manifestações mundiais. Alô? E ao mesmo tempo que houve um empoderamento, houve uma organização e houve uma tomada de ruas, né, houve característica bastante efêmera, bastante diluída desses movimentos, né? Ao mesmo tempo que também colocou os movimentos sociais urbanos como grandes protagonistas, né? Semana passada a gente, por exemplo, teve em São Paulo uma manifestação com mais de 20 mil trabalhadores sem teto, organizado pelo MTST, que é o Movimento Sem Teto, que muitos consideram hoje como um movimento social mais dinâmico, que se colocou aí, o seu fortalecimento é uma resposta organizativa de junho, mas ao mesmo tempo houve essa efemeridade. A minha pergunta é como que o senhor vê a forma com que podemos organizar essa indignação, né? E qual que é a opinião do professor sobre as experiências que temos na Espanha, através do Podemos, e na Grécia, através do Syriza, que são partidos com expressão de massa e com uma agenda anticapitalista, né? Obviamente não é uma resposta fechada ou única para isso, mas principalmente como nós podemos transformar as ruas em programa, em disputa de poder e que possamos definitivamente dar tchau para o capitalismo.
Boa noite, professor. Meu nome é Camila. A minha pergunta é, considerando essa virada esse deslocamento do capital para os processos globais de urbanização excludente e o consequente aumento do gasto necessário para se viver na cidade, como que isso se reflete nos processos de produção, no processo produtivo, considerando que isso vai refletir um aumento de tempo de trabalho necessário para a reprodução da classe trabalhadora?
Boa noite, professor. Alex Ferreira Garcia, mestre pela Universidade Federal do Paraná em Geografia. Tenho duas questões a colocar. Primeiramente, usando o plano Marshall, feito pelos Estados Unidos, que produziram muito mais dólar do que lastro, fazendo a crise financeira não ter fim, porque você produz dinheiro conforme a demanda, ou até mesmo além da demanda. Porque hoje o dólar é uma moeda sem lastro, e fazer com que os países tenham suas reservas em dólar, por consequência, boa parte dos países não tem lastro para nada. Assim sendo, eles têm dólar guardado, que é uma moeda vazia, sem ter algo, uma relação, uma mercadoria, um produto ou algo que sustente ela por si, numa economia fictícia baseada nisso. Então, há se de colocar assim, o sistema financeiro pode se reproduzir eternamente, colocado que ele pode fazer dinheiro conforme a necessidade, e tendo necessidade ele produz. Esse é o primeiro ponto a colocar. E o segundo ponto é frente ao imperialismo, colocado pelo professor, ainda citando John Maynard Keynes, que é colocado que a proteção do mercado pós-crise de 1929 faz com que algumas economias protejam pontos estratégicos. Infelizmente a nossa não faz isso. A nossa própria economia automobilística e brasileira inexiste pós-década de 90 e abertura do nosso mercado. A Gurgel, que era brasileira, faliu, entre outras. Os Estados Unidos fez isso agora, protegendo a sua economia, e principalmente indústrias estratégicas automobilísticas como a GM, General Motors, que foi estatizada, parte dela pós-crise de 2008, sendo ela estratégica, colocada pelo governo estadunidense. Aí eu coloco a segunda pergunta, frente ao imperialismo, ou seja, estamos mais numa queda de braço entre impérios e empresas, ou uma crise do capital praticamente impossível?
Boa noite, professor. Meu nome é Lucas, eu sou estudante da UFPR de Engenharia de Controle e Automação. E eu gostaria de saber qual o papel da tecnologia nesse processo e anseio a um novo sistema econômico e social, sabendo que é bem pertinente a exploração dos meios sociais e naturais, no que você pode chamar de overconsumption, como que ela pode vir positivamente para essa mudança? Obrigado.
Olá, professor, meu nome é Camila. Você falou um pouco da questão dos commodities, da produção de alimentos, na verdade, totalmente cooptar e dominar o capital. E hoje a gente sabe que a produção de alimentos no Brasil e no mundo, ela é um risco para a própria soberania e segurança alimentar e nutricional das populações, tanto brasileira quanto do mundial. E a gente tem algumas políticas no Brasil, poucas ainda, mas que têm tentado fortalecer a agricultura familiar e preferencialmente a agroecológica. Mas é um processo de luta social para que essa agricultura seja fortalecida. E eu queria ouvir um pouco sobre como você concebe, como você percebe o fortalecimento da agricultura familiar no processo revolucionário, né? Haja vista que a produção de alimentos é um risco mesmo para a segurança e soberania alimentar e nutricional. Obrigada.
Professor, com essa pergunta, nós encerramos então o último bloco de questões e o senhor pode passar então as respostas.
I'm sorry, I lost a bit of the translation on the last question, but I'll do my best with it. I think Marx has a very interesting way of handling interest and speculation, and I'll just mention it very briefly. The thrust of Volume 2 is to look very strongly at the problem of turnover time, how fast things turn over, and how do you match different turnover times and fixed capital formation and all the rest of it. And the conclusion Marx comes to is that actually capital would absolutely stop to circulate unless it had a credit system to deal with the differential turnover times that exist in society. In other words, the credit system becomes absolutely necessary and foundational to the functioning of capital. If this is the case, then the credit system, unfortunately, becomes a law unto itself, and this is what Marx starts to write about in his chapters on the credit system in Volume 3. And when it becomes a law unto itself, it becomes impossible to regulate in ways other than through arbitrary interventions on the part of bank regulators and the like. So that the question of rent and interest does not follow the logic that Marx earlier set out in Capital. It actually starts to have it dance to its own tune, as it were. This poses some problems for Marx's analysis, which he didn't really resolve in Volume 3, and it leaves us with the problem of how to best interpret the way in which the extractions of rent and the extractions of interest are becoming much more prominent now in the society we live in than the actual extraction of wealth from production processes. The second question dealt with the ephemerality of many of the movements that have emerged. I think this is indeed a characteristic that we've seen over the last 15 years. That movements come and go very fast, sometimes very effective and dramatic, and then disappear. If I had a solution to how to put it all together and actually make the revolution, I would have done it by now, and we wouldn't be sitting here. So this is a general problem, and it's one which I don't have a particular solution to, and it just as and I'm not an organizer. I have a hard time organizing my own life. If it weren't for Boitempo, I would have been lost in Brazil some time ago. Organizing all of this is, I think, a significant kind of problem, and getting some continuity in it. But I think in this, the continuity also has to be assured by adequate theoretical reflection. And one of the criticisms I might have of some of my Marxist colleagues is that all they want to do is to talk about a falling rate of profit theory or something of that sort, rather than sort of talk about how do we reflect upon the sort of theoretical situation we are in and what our responses should be. Because actually saying that everything that happens is due to the falling rate of profit doesn't help me do anything. It just says, oh, well, I guess we wait for it to fall even further and see what happens. So I think that kind of a richer investigation of the relationship between social movements, the actors in the social movements, where value is being produced and how it's being produced. There is a tendency for Marxists to think about the proletariat as being the person who makes cars or something of that kind, but I try to point out that people who make hamburgers, why if you make cars are you producing value, and if you make a hamburger you're not? I think making hamburgers is just as productive a value as taking cars, which says that actually the workers in McDonald's are value producing, and we therefore have to think about the organization of McDonald's workers, and by the way, they are getting organized. Very interesting, which leads into the question about technologies, that the technology of organizing McDonald's workers has been provided free, and this is again where the free software development stuff becomes important, provided free by some of the software development community, who found ways to put McDonald's workers in different cities in the United States in contact with each other. So when they decide not to turn up to work one day and have in effect a McDonald's strike, it happens in several cities simultaneously. Now this has an interesting impact, because if the McDonald's workers go out in just one city, like Detroit or somewhere,
You know, it may make the local press, but when McDonald's workers go out in 50 or 60 cities simultaneously at exactly the same moment, the same time, people notice. And then you kind of go, all right, well, you know, what are they demanding? They're demanding better wages, work conditions, and the like. And so the new technologies have I think, a capacity for use, but again, it depends upon the availability of the free labor, which is going to give to the McDonald's workers a network, a communication network, which is solid and secure, which they can then use in developing their activism. The whole kind of question of the dollar and the position of money in society, this is a very, very crucial question. And of course, it is a foundational fact to American imperialism that the American power over the dollar, which is the global reserve currency, gives it an immense imperial power. And it uses that power pretty ruthlessly to its own advantages, and defends that power pretty ruthlessly. The point about money, however, is this, and Marx pointed this out. He said that when you're faced with a situation of wanting to have an infinite accumulation of capital, what form of capital can actually accumulate without any restraint and can be infinitely large? The answer is money. You can add zeros to the money supply. And in fact, this is what we're doing in many ways, is adding zeros to the money supply. And the fact that, and I think it's very important to recognize the significance of going off the metallic base to the global money system in the early 1970s. It created a completely different world. And this completely different world of monetary creation leads into the issue of to what degree is the world now surviving on the creation of fictitious forms of capital, fictitious forms of wealth, which, however, do get realized in the monetary power form. So this is the critique of money right now is a very important topic that we should be paying much more attention to, and it's very much connected to the question of imperial power and what American imperial power is about. I've already mentioned something about technology, and I think that the new technologies are actually opening up possibilities of new configurations. But notice something. Notice something about hidden forms of exploitation which occur. Ask yourself the question, who creates value in Google? The answer is we do. We actually provide the value that creates the value in Google. Then who appropriates the value of Google? You? No. The owners of Google extract rents from our labor. And this is very interesting. We're getting more and more elements of this kind where we are actually the ones producing the value. And this is what artificial intelligence is all about. You go to the airport now, you check yourself in. You go to the supermarket in the United States and you check yourself out. In fact, we are doing more and more of the labor, which is actually productive labor, but we're not getting remunerated for it. In fact, we're engaging in more and more unremunerated labor from which people are extracting rent. You know, so these people who run Facebook and Google and LinkedIn and all these things are extracting, I mean, they're all billionaires. They're extracting vast amounts of rent from my labor, your labor, and you kind of go, well, hey, how about, you know, Google paying us for a bit, instead of us, in effect, providing free labor for Google. So the technology is very interesting, and it has some interesting implications, particularly for this cognitive technology issue and cognitive value and so on. I think it's a very significant area of investigation and inquiry. The last question was about food sovereignty and local foods and things. And I'm very sympathetic to movements to try to create as much possible self-sustaining food supplies. It seems to me crazy that we have a situation where in order to get foreign exchange, you use agricultural resources to, I don't know, send roses to New York City. But you then use up your land and your water in such a way that you then have to import food. from elsewhere when you could be self-sustaining in food. I think that this is a kind of crazy world we're living in, where a lot of agrarian practices now are so export-oriented and foreign exchange value-oriented that we're not looking to the actual creation of local food supplies on a sustainable, I dislike the word sustainable, because who's in favor of unsustainability? You know, it's one of those favorite words that everybody likes to use. But working with local food supplies seems to me to be a very good idea, to the degree that it can actually function. But I disagree with those who think that you can be locally self-sufficient. One of the good things capital did was to eliminate the possibility of a global famine. There have been global famines under capitalism, but it's because capitalism wasn't allowed to work. Actually, it is the fact that everything is linked together in the world, and that therefore a harvest failure here could be compensated for by a surplus crop there, that this is one of the great benefits that capital has bequeathed. So to try to actually reverse all of that and say we want to go back to local self-sufficiency, and then for somebody who does agricultural work every now and again and suffers the crisis that comes when ants eat all your damn food, you then have a real problem on your hand, and you've got to find a supply from somewhere else. So I think that sometimes the food sovereignty movement goes too far over the hill and imagines a world in which you'll have lots of local self-sufficient communities. Never happen, never should happen, but we can go much further towards local food supplies and not get into this export orientation of agricultural products simply for foreign exchange value, when actually that means that we import commodities from elsewhere. So that's that question. I didn't hear all of the questions, so I hope that is a comment that will be adequate to that. So I guess that's it. So thanks very much.